Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Art Laboratory Berlin. My name is Regina Rapp, and we are so happy to are together here in an online discussion organized and moderated by Kristina Stallvik. And Kristina brought along in the publishing Ecologies panel discussion amazing guests. But I leave it to Kristina later on to present those. And I'd like to present to you Kristina. And that's a big pleasure because we have been working with Kristina for quite some time now during the fellowship that Kristina is realizing. And before Kristina will put you into the topic of the night or the morning or the evening or the midday, I'd like to present you Kristina Stallvik. As Kristina is an artist, a researcher, and a founder of the publishing project Cover Prop. And recent exhibitions of Kristina and our non-productive readers, a performance or Between Bridges that took part in Berlin last year. Also another project, a Slow Leak NAP in Berlin from last year. And another project was also Bubble Bath, Magna Maria in Frankfurt that took part last year. And in Reykjavik, there was a project by Kristina with the title Act 1, Nilis Dasafnit. And 2 years ago, there was a Dara League Press in the Kunsthal Trondheim, or a thing shared Automat in Philadelphia, also 2 years. And recent publications from Kristina include Landing in Lumbung Press and Documenta from 2023. Kristina lives and works here in Berlin. And since spring 2023, you, Kristina, have been a Chancellor Fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation with Art Laboratory Berlin as the host institution. And you have been researching the collective structures that comprise independent artist book and zine publishing in Berlin and around, as you see, so many projects evolved. And Kristina, before I hand over to you and leave you moderating and guiding through the whole event, let me just share the big pleasure and the excitement of having realized already so many projects with you, Kristina. And as you can see on our website, on Art Laboratory Berlin's website, there is a research, and there is Zine Ecologies, the research of Kristina. And you can see many events already, not only your research. So there will be also an exhibition coming up. We can say this at the end as well. Intermediate Exploring the Visual was an event actually that we did in September last year with the risograph machine. And but there's coming up an exhibition, Kristina, that you have been working on, intermediate objects, in end of February and until the end of March. And so the research also you put actually into when we had a festival, the Flinter in Art, Science and Technology last summer. And you did a Fluxonial shelf with texts for and from Flinter touring within the festival. And then also, Kristina, you contributed with your research in the colloquium. And tonight we have Publishing Ecologies, a discussion which we are very, very much looking forward to. It takes place in the context of the so-called Vorspiel 2024. This is an event taking part in context of the Transmediale Multimedia Festival here in Berlin and the CTM Festival. So, dear Kristina, it is a big pleasure to have you and the wonderful hosts. And thank you everyone for coming and listening. As you heard, we would like to record the presentations, and we decided to turn off the recording after the presentations so everyone can very freely put questions and intermingle without any issues of then ending up in a recorded archive. And also an idea was, and I see probably most of you already did that, thank you so much, to turn off maybe your video and for the recordings. So here you are, Kristina. Thank you so much for preparing that event.
Thank you, Regina. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for our discussion on publishing ecologies. Thank you, Chris and Regina, for the introduction and for hosting, and of course, for all of the ongoing dialogue that we've had over the past year that I've been working in Berlin. Just a quick note before we start. Unfortunately, Jessie from Onomatopee Projects is not able to make it tonight. So we will definitely be missing her a lot this evening, but you can still check out all of the really great work that they're publishing. And hopefully we'll have more chances to collaborate in the future. Getting right into it, I also want to say a big thanks to who we do have here tonight, Oscar and Aiden, for joining us this evening. And I'm really excited to hear what they're going to share about their practices. I'm also really excited to talk about the role of publication in how we can build and expand interspecies relationships and our understanding of them, and the ways that we can the ways that centering ecology might impact the practice of creating and archiving printed matter. So this is kind of the theme of our talk here tonight. Yeah, and for me, these questions of interspecies relationality really require sitting with a lot of constant fluidity and unknowing, which is something that can be tricky at times, but I think something that's really fruitful to talk about, and also kind of inherently leads to considerations of the ways that we define the human itself and the ways that these definitions are always shifting, and a recognition that there's this history of social construction behind how we understand species categories and the creation of them. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to highlight these questions within systems of knowledge production and distribution. And for this talk, we're going to be focusing on systems such as publishing and bookmaking. And I think now I'll briefly introduce Oscar and Aiden, and then they will have a chance to speak a bit more in depth on their work and their relationship to publishing. So first joining us, we have Oscar Salguero. Oscar is a researcher, archivist, and curator based in Brooklyn, New York. And since 2019, he's been running the Interspecies Library, which is an archive dedicated to artist books that explore alternative interspecies futures. In 2021, Oscar curated the show Interspecies Futures at the Center for Book Arts in New York, which contained a survey of these books, and many of which focused on speculative fiction as a method for conceiving of interspecies possibilities. More recently, he curated a show NEO Mineralia at the Center for Craft in North Carolina, and this was an exhibition that both imagined and materialized new geological specimens, such as synthetic and digital rocks. Also joining us is Aiden Koch. Aiden is an artist, graphic novelist, and the founder of Institute for Interspecies Art and Relations, an institute which hosts workshops, screenings, walks, art projects, and educational events around the world, which aims to unify the theory, ethics, and creative practice around our relationship with other species. The Institute also publishes material in collaboration with artists and animal specialists and does work to directly support animals. So thank you again so much, Oscar and Aiden, for being here, especially with all of us being really spread out geographically in terms of time zone. It's really special to be able to gather here in the context of the transmediale Vorspiel. Maybe Oscar, if you want to start with giving us a further introduction to your work and anything you want to highlight in the context of the discussion, and then we can hand it off to Aiden.
Hi, Kristina. Thank you for your introduction and for your invitation. Yes, so I'd love to tell you about my project, and so I'm just going to share my screen now. You guys can tell me if you can see it. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, looks great.
Right.
Cool. There's a lot of slides, but I move pretty fast. This is kind of an introduction into this project. So Interspecies Library kind of starts, I would say, in 2015. It's like the first time I noticed this kind of terms floating around in books and artist books. Terms such as non-human, more than human, interspecies, multi-species. As you can see, this is a selection of just some books from the last 7 or 8 years that have those terms. So that really caught my attention. I'm a person who I'm originally trained as a designer, industrial designer, and I was really curious why we were always taught in school this idea of human-centric design, and we never really talked about designing for other species. So I was already very intrigued by these terms. So I started really getting interested to find out more about them. And I'll show you an example of a book that I came across in 2007, so a long time ago, which is called Pig 05049. Like myself, this artist, Christian Main-Dertsma, is trained in design, but she devoted a couple of years to researching how all the things that come from a single pig after it's killed, after we basically start using every single part of one animal. And she developed this encyclopedia, or this book, sort of basically showing you all of the derivatives or products that come out of one animal that we interact with every day on our daily lives, but we don't understand that it actually comes from the collagen, the bones, skin of one species. So that already got me, very very interested in the subject, this kind of critical perspective on our interspecies relationships. And then in 2019, my wife Benedict and I got a cat. So for me, it was the first time I lived with an animal. To have a pet with me, it really affected the way I perceived even my own space, my own reality, sense of time. I was really touched by this experience, and together with my wife, we decided, why don't we just do something in our apartment? So that became this show in 2020, Human and Human. By then, I had already been sort of started to buy and collect certain books on this subject of interspecies. So I call it Human and Human, 10 books on interspecies interactions. It was January 2020, showcased a number of books on the subject, from photo books to even a master thesis project from a design student, Ege, which I think it's joining us today. And what I did was take this opportunity to present these really interesting books from different perspectives and ask visitors to tell me how they felt about these type of interactions. So I created this system on the wall, which I called observing, collaborating, exploiting, and becoming. So anyone who got a chance to look at the books could tag with colors what kind of interactions they felt the author was exploring. So some of them were really exploitative relationships, or some of them were more collaborative, and many actually really all over the place. This experience helped me push this idea. I started interviewing the authors and printing their interviews. I started digging into the history of books and that talk about interspecies, such as this one from 1665, which shows the first time in history a scientist draws what a microorganism looks like. This is called micrographia. So, things like this, where a book can be such a powerful tool to showcase a reality that's the micro world that we cannot see with our bare eyes, to me was really exciting. And then it also made me look at books such as After Man, A Zoology of the Future, which is from 1981, in which a scientist and geologist imagines the future of Earth 50 million years into the future, and what kind of species continue to exist here in this planet once we are extinct. So this sort of use of imagination was really, really exciting to me. And the fact that they chose book formats was also very, very interesting. So fast forward to 2021, I got a chance to present a show at Center for Book Arts. And here I decided to focus only on artist books created in the last 5 years, touching on the subject of interspecies. And one thing I noticed is that many of these artists were inspired by, on one hand, speculative fiction, science fiction, such as Ursula Le Guin's work, and on the other hand, by contemporary, like posthumanism and different ways of where philosophies are touching on the non-human, such as the work of Donna Haraway. So these two sort of like big influences were really, really obvious in the works that I decided to present at Center for Book Arts. So the show was called Interspecies Futures. It happened in spring 2021 during COVID, the pandemic. So barely, not many people actually came or knew about it because nobody was coming to the galleries, which is also a really interesting data point here for the show, which is about interspecies. So there's two big desks or tables that I prepare. On one hand, on the right side, were books that I identified by independent publishers over the last few years. And on the left table, there were books that I specifically commissioned to practitioners or artists who were looking at this subject. And I challenged them to present an original book for this show. So the great thing about this experience is that it led me to really solidify the concept of an interspecies library. So this is an example of that. I prepare event programming for that, and also a little catalog. Interspecies Futures was published by Center for Book Arts. And yeah, here are some of the books to show you like the level of conceptual sort of formats that they adopted to express the stories about each species. And just to kind of like end this part with this introduction, the next thing that I'm working on is an index or an online index of all of the books that I have been finding or coming across. So this is interspecieslibrary.com. It's been great to do this project because I get to share all of these amazing projects with, for example, this is a show in Brooklyn. This one is one in Prague, Czech Republic. And finally, one of the most interesting things for me is to be able to share this with visitors. I have all these books here in my apartment. I don't really have a budget to have a proper space, so I'm happy to host a lot of visitors to come in and talk about the books and really sort of inspire and create a hub for conversation and ideas interchange. So yeah, that's all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Oscar. Aiden, do you want to jump in?
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Kristina. And it's so fun to do this with you, Oscar, too, because yeah, we have so many, intertwining kind of like interests, and yeah, with books especially, which is of course what it's about, but it's still so fun. But yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll give a little context, and also I don't have slides, but I have just like the website to share and like ephemera here. So maybe I'll talk while I start browsing through the site and share that, so there's something to look at. But yeah, so my project, Institute for Interspecies Art and Relations, I started this in 2017, late 2017. And yeah, really it was initially felt like a response to a few things. One being like, I come from comics and I come from zine making, and I'd always done book fairs and art book fairs, and kind of noticed that there wasn't any kind of consistent representation of ecological material. At least at the fairs I was going to, there wasn't one publisher to kind of turn to. There wasn't one kind of artist that I could check in on and see what was new. A lot of that work was scattered among a bunch of different publishers, or it was kind of hard to find, even though, I know those things were existing. And yeah, there was something where I was like, I know this material is out there and being made, and want to see these things represented at, in particular, these kind of like art book fairs and zine fairs, because the ideas feel so naturally interconnected with that to me, about DIY production and distribution, and yeah, just kind of like a place that I turn to usually to kind of find these like interesting different pathways for thinking and creating. And I think we're definitely in a time where the kind of ecological thought making is very strong, and of course in response to like the dire situations in the world, but yeah, that's something that I think I was feeling too. So like this stuff needs to be here because yeah, things are really changing fast. And I think especially as artists, it's so important to respond to that and to integrate those thoughts into one's practice, and acknowledge it. So yeah, so I wanted to start something that was like, oh, this would be something I'll collaborate and I'll have these materials and I'll bring them to art fair or art book fairs, and zine fairs, and try and be that resource that I was looking for. And it kind of ended up in all these different pathways that I didn't expect. And yeah, it's been interesting. I've let it grow really organically. And when I started, I lived in New York. I now am situated in Landers, California, which is traditional homeland of the Serrano people, their unceded territory. And this is part of the Mojave Desert. So I'm in a very different place than I was when I started. And I think through that too, some of like the ideas behind the project have shifted. But yeah, I did start with this idea of like making printed objects to have at fairs and have available. So some of the very first projects, like this photo book was the first book we put out, and we put it out on Earth Day, and I guess that was probably 2018. Yeah, with a couple different naturalists who also have a background in arts. And yeah, it was very natural, kind of coming together, and something that was like, oh, this is, amazing too, because it's ecological, but it's also feminist, and it fits these kind of like interconnected conversations. Yeah, and a zine by a friend who's a cartoonist who I also knew had this kind of like parallel life as an extreme birder, and trying to like talk to people that I was already in communication with and in the kind of arts community in New York, and see what they maybe want to put out there. And yeah, that the projects have extended from cassettes. This is with a collective, or it's two people who are in Miami and who use a lot of field recordings. So like this cassette was a kind of imagined conversation between a formerly extinct Floridian bird and one that is on the brink of extinction, using both of these like documented recordings to kind of communicate between those two species and think about this kind of these echoes and reverberations of something that's now missing from this landscape, and something that is its presence is diminished from this landscape. Yeah, I mean, I won't go over everything, but yeah, I've always kind of been trying to put out these different types of materials and be in communication with people who I know are interested in these conversations as well. Yeah, and of course, that's all been really inspiring and fun to work on. And I think the collaborative element for me was really important. I think because all this in some ways was an answer to my own kind of insecurities growing up, just about animals and the planet, and just loving being in a really rich world of different species. And yeah, my own concerns just about the loss of biodiversity and the loss of having these special creatures around. So yeah, that kind of was like a really important part for us. It pushed me, especially to kind of see where this could go and reach out to people and build community. But yeah, so I mean, of course, I ended up moving here and the pandemic, and so there was kind of less presence in terms of doing the like book fair part. But then kind of other things started to happen more. These are events and collaborations. This stuff kind of just started being something too that I was putting together. So I've done different projects in a bunch of different cities now. The original one being in New York and having an art show, having talks, having walks. Yeah, just kind of putting something together that felt pretty immersive and something anyone could step into and have questions and curiosities, and was also kind of integrated within the arts community. Because I think that in New York, at least, was like my dominant community that I was around, and seeing that there wasn't like a huge representation of ecological conversations in New York. And, part of that, of course, it's a very human-centric place. It's a hugely built environment. And I think a lot of people there being transplants, it's like, there's not a lot of familiarity with the native ecosystem. So hoping that this was something that would get people looking around too at their own landscapes and just being curious. But different projects have ended up in Portland, Oregon, Los Angeles, and combining with drawing too, which is my own personal medium and something that I love so much. And that also being a way of trying to engage people with the practice of observation and noticing and transcribing those things onto paper, which again kind of like leads to the possibilities of reproduction and these documents that hold those moments in history. So this is kind of just like the different types of projects that have ended up happening, which some of them may come up more, but and I also similarly turned to books and collecting books, and have not found, I think I've only brought them to 2 events and had them kind of just like scattered around. So not in a way that anyone could just like actually pick one up and read it, but as a way to just put those out there, be like, well, you can take a photo, you can write it down. There's like, I also always share on like the Iffy Art Instagram, I'll like share one when I'm done reading it and give a little like synopsis. And also sometimes we'll just like, if anyone asks, give them a million different recommendations based on what their interests are. So I think for me too, this was like a documentation project of me reading and wanting to know more and educating myself. I think having a background in illustration, this feels really distant from my original like education. So I went kind of down this project of self-educating, and I just was so excited to see how much was out there and how many different angles you can kind of take. And despite my project being very much, try and keep it kind of like animal centric, also seeing like, but you can kind of go down these different tangents that are all related still, and building the library in that way of, going from various kind of like anarchist ways of thinking to folk tales to comics, like these different forms that I think still deeply inform kind of the relations, which I think is an important part of the foundation of this project, that it's like it's all relationships with each other, with other species, with these kind of like larger communities. So let's see. And a lot of it is printed materials and objects. There's always something coming out. And especially like with people who do orders, always trying to have something extra to put in. So like this was a vegan kitchen essentials guide that my friend Nick Norman and his partner Chelsea put together. And yeah, something that's just like really simple and funny and you can put on your fridge. But I think is really informative for people who maybe don't have intros to vegan cooking, and various thoughts about that. And here's some of the other, like the actual material itself, like the zines, Lala zine, and this photo book. Yeah, because I do like, I love the physicality, despite the website being probably the primary place that people encounter this project. Yeah, having it grounded in these objects is also, for me, very important also. But yeah, that's kind of, I think, what I've got to share for now before we get into it.
Yes, thank you for bringing the physical ephemera. I feel like that's an important component to actually kind of see. I'm always like surprised when I'm working on a publication digitally and then I actually like see the dimensions of it and the shape of it like in print. It just takes on this whole new life. So I feel like that's, yeah, thank you for bringing the actual objects. Yeah, and thank you both so much. It was really nice to hear about your work in your own words after I've kind of been reading and looking into it and following both of your practices for a while. I think, yeah, what kind of stood out to me from the ways that you both described your practices just now is sort of both in the content, a focus on intersubjectivity, of course, and kind of in these different human-animal relationships, but also kind of in your method and how you work, in terms of really centering collaboration and working with friends, and yeah, really paying attention to what happens in between people and animals rather than just in these like entities themselves. Yeah, and also kind of this focus on, with you, Oscar, like opening your actual apartment and your private space to your projects. I think that's really beautiful, and also this focus on your immediate surroundings and kind of having your situatedness kind of dictate the type of work you feel like you need to be making. Yeah, I really appreciate hearing those kind of motivations behind everything you both were doing. Yeah, I guess also kind of themes of scale, and really an attention to when things should be dispersed and when things should be gathered. I kind of noticed, and I thought that was really cool, in what both of you were sharing. Yeah, so I kind of wanted to get into asking some questions that I've been curious about for a while. And I think afterwards we'll save some time to open up the discussion to everyone in the audience as well. But yeah, I'd like for this to be kind of as much of a free form discussion as it can be. So Oscar and Aiden, you guys can jump in with any questions or ask each other questions. And if anyone in the audience has any burning questions at any point, you can put it in the chat and then we'll get back to it at the end. Yeah, so kind of to start off at the beginning, I was wondering, since you're both working in these really interdisciplinary, or maybe just kind of totally disregarding the disciplinary in a way, I'm wondering kind of how publishing interacts with these other activities that you're doing and these other facets of your practice, and how maybe you notice it informing them, or how maybe it's behaving differently. Yeah, so kind of the relationship between all the different activities that you're engaged with and how this impacts the way that you would define publishing or the way you think about publishing.
Yeah, I mean, publishing. So I haven't really. The only time I really published something was this catalog for the exhibition.
Mhm.
But it was a really interesting experience because I worked with a dear friend who I met, my friend Claudia de la Torre, who I met at New York Art Book Fair in 2018. So I saw her work on books, her publishing project is called Backbone Books, and it's based in Berlin.
Mhm.
You probably know her, right?
Yes,
I think
actually,
you know.
I curated some of her work in my show at AP, so yeah, we're familiar.
Claudia is amazing. So since then, I mean, also there was this kind of idea of like I'm from Peru and she's from Mexico. We kind of had this interesting connection, and I promised her since we met that we should work on something together. So it was a beautiful experience working with her. That's as far as my publishing, my own personal publishing experience goes. but we put a lot of love and like, you know, ideas and concepts and into this subject that is, it sounds, I mean, into the subject interspecies, it sounds, and I would say it's like an ancient subject. It's like the beginning of human relationships is also an interspecies, you know, experience from the get-go, you know, the first drawings that we found on caves, you know, the first like drawings by humans are of other animals. I even wonder if we can call those publications, right? They're, you know, earlier human groups were already drawing and putting something on a wall or in any surface they had available, and they were already expressing these kind of interactions with other species. So yeah, this idea of publication, I think, is something that it's really kind of embedded in us as a species, sort of a documentation of our thoughts or our fears or our emotions, our ideas in some sort of format that can stand time, you know, and be accessed by someone else. I definitely want to continue to explore this. I am a big fan of the work of Aiden, like with the interspecies, with EFR. In fact, I knew about it because of my wife, who is an artist, and she told me also many years ago, back in 2018 already, about Aiden's project. So for me, it was like, wow, it's so beautiful that an artist can just start an institute, right? Can just start a space or a platform to talk about these really important subjects. To me, I mean, that's a really big inspiration to me. That's how, you know, I decided maybe this is a library. You know, it can be a shelf. It is a library if you want to call it a library and if you want to involve people. So yeah, just kind of.
I guess so you've had this kind of one more like official experience of publishing, but I guess in terms of your use of publication and books, you've had more experience commissioning and curating.
Yes.
So would you say that you kind of approach the process of curating artist books in a similar way than you would approach the process of curating art objects or other artworks, or have you experienced kind of differences in how that's been?
I think it's very different. I think our books are more meant to be accessed, you know. I feel that when people see a book, they want to handle them. Artworks are a little bit different. They seem to me more alien in general as artifacts, or some a little bit more you like hesitate to approach them in a way. And I think curating artworks, artist books, sorry, it's a really interesting process because you have to think about how the visitor wants to handle them or at their own pace. You know, there is no indications how long you can spend with each book. But in my experience, I'm much more inclined to work with books than artifacts, because of this intuition that we have this intuitive relationship with books.
How about you, Aiden? What's been kind of your experience with working with publishing alongside doing all these other quite maybe like physical or embodied things, like in terms of like actually going on walks or like doing workshops where you're actively like making something or?
Yeah. Well, first, shout out to Bene, Oscar's wife, who does have a worksheet on the website that I was scrolling through, and for connecting us. But yeah, I think that there's, at times it's been kind of confusing having so many different things happening at once. But also, I don't know, I think it is kind of how I operate. And I think that's part of like the challenges and kind of the absurdity of doing this project as one person, is it really is like moves with kind of a different rhythm, I think, than if this was like yes, a larger kind of like real institute. I mean, it's real, but it also is like, it's just me. But I kind of have really liked that part of it. Yeah, kind of like Oscar saying, like, there is something cool being like, I'm just going to make this and, you know, pretend that it's official until it is. Or just kind of, yeah, just see what can happen with it. And yeah, I've used that to respond more to kind of just the conversations I am having and the opportunities that arise, and not to define exactly what I'm doing from the get-go. I think all of my kind of original expectations have changed. And there's, yeah, it's very adaptive, which I also, in some ways, I'm like, well, that's very like ecological. But yeah, I think I haven't done as much publishing more recently too. And part of me kind of like feels like, oh, but isn't that maybe more important? I should be focusing on that. But then kind of the events also feel really dynamic. And yeah, kind of the movement between both has felt really meaningful. I think definitely not having the presence of book fairs for a couple of years made it so publishing felt less engaging. I think because the presence of being at a fair, talking to people, showing people what you're doing, those conversations are so inspiring and motivating. And yeah, like, and building the community person to person is what has kept me like motivated for this project, because it really is like built on my own personal passion. Yeah, and so having the chance to do events, and those kind of came back before book fairs did. Even the fact that like a lot of the things I've done have been outside for the last couple of years. And yeah, and with those, like having people physically around, people to communicate with and kind of like explore these different ideas in these like situated locations, that is, yeah, that has been very motivating and exciting. But I mean, the books and reading books, collecting books in general, I mean, that's just something that I'm obsessed with. Like, again, kind of coming from comics and zine making, I'm like, well, everything should become a book, right? Like any project, any idea, it's like, you can really like, yeah, you can compile any sort of process into a publication, and through that, connect yourself to others. I think that's where like zine making and DIY culture was like so important to me as a younger artist. It was like kind of the first way that I made community, and also like found an audience and found interlocutors. Like, yeah, it to me, it's like it comes very naturally as a way to connect with others. And yeah, and I mean, it's like, it doesn't have to be making those things necessarily, like through Oscar's projects, like sharing those things and curating those things. There's something that's like really tangible and like, yeah, that just like hooks me about books as objects and as like physical things in space. Yeah, but I think like the movement between various projects gets a little muddy sometimes. And even I find that like in the years since I started IFER, it's like bled into my other practices, you know, which is not to say that these things should kind of be like solid projects on their own, but like a couple years ago, I kind of started like an offshoot that was more comics oriented. That's like more like looking into environmental comics as a medium, a discipline, a like a practice, and being curious about that too. So now I have this little like side collection growing that's like environmental comics. Yeah, I think you can just go endless directions with it.
When it comes to your like more graphic novel and comic practice, I was kind of curious how you work with the relationship between text and image, especially in this idea that you just said of like, you can really make anything into a publication. For me, it really then becomes a question of like how to represent things through text or image, or how to make the two speak with each other. And I was kind of wondering what your experience has been with that, and then maybe also, Oscar, how you've experienced that through the books that you've been curating, or like what you're looking for in terms of this relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a really important note. And maybe part of why this, like, my kind of like pathway down back into kind of melding this with comics has felt really important. Especially having like gone through the phases of getting very heavy into the kind of theory side of like the interspecies world. Which, yeah, not having any background in that, some of that reading has been extremely challenging. But, you know, very meaningful and informative. But I think the essence of comics, which kind of is this like dynamic between image, text, and like sequencing and kind of like the unfolding of time. To me, like as an artist, that's been very exciting, because I think you can kind of enter these more ambiguous worlds and ambiguous ways of describing realities. Yeah, and I found that to be like a really inspiring concept, especially when thinking of like, well, how do you kind of represent different perspectives? Or even start to think about that and how you represent that. And of course, like the English language is not perfect for everything. So finding that space where you are kind of like playing with words and language, but also with how image like juxtaposes it. Yeah, I think that gets pretty deep into like other ways of imagining reality, and that different realities are existing at the same time. So yeah, having kind of like the idea of like having observational drawing, or like human perspective layered with these different styles or different like imagined perspectives, I think is really natural within the comics form and exciting.
It's cool. I really like the way you're doing all of this under the title of like institute, because it's kind of similar to use this term that carries so much authority and so much like kind of sanctioned normative respect or something like that, and then use it in this way. It's kind of similar to kind of like hacking the book format by kind of taking the authority that books are assumed to have as like this way to circulate information and then turning it into something else. So I think that's cool.
Well, that's why the happy bug is like the best mascot for it. So like, yeah, it like grounds it as an institute.
Yeah. How did you design that? What was the process?
It was like, it came from, there was like some little detail in this like painting I found in like a museum show. And this is like a complete like reimagining of that. But there was some kind of bug, and I'm trying to remember her name. There was this painter show that was up at New Museum. I don't know, there's just this little detail, and I kind of always do. I take a lot of photos at museums and like redraw things or think about things. And yeah, there was just a strange caterpillar that I was like obsessed with, and like kind of redrew it in all these different ways. And then it became this, and it's so friendly. But yeah,
I love it.
that bug.
It kind of almost reminds me of like the style of some animals in Disney films, and thinking about the role that animals play in those movies that are very prevalent in our cultural imagination. But oh yeah.
I was just thinking about your question. I think so. Yeah, I agree with Aiden about these formats of especially with comics. They make complex stories sort of more approachable in even different ways, right? From emotional perspective or a narrative innovations. I agree that it's an incredible format. A lot of the books that I'm interested in are graphic, but not necessarily on the comics genre, but also on different, for sure, different like text and images combinations. I would say that in my particular case, I'm really interested in artist books. artist books being this kind of rethinking or reinterpretation or subversion of the expectations of what a book can be. And I think it lends itself well for this kind of topic, being interspecies or imagining other ways of being. Right now I'm working on a sort of a small show that is gonna come up at Pratt Institute at the end of February. It's a short 2-week exhibition of some of the books. And I'm calling it Decentering Strategies. So basically thinking of the book as a tool for decentering the human and attuning to other species way of perceiving or being. I think it's really interesting that a lot of these artists also kind of feed themselves with these more theoretical books, like from academia or from philosophy, are really dense and really complex and introducing a lot of new terms and new ideas. And they sort of synthesize that and present it in these interesting ways that sometimes manifest in formats that are less intellectual, but even more visceral. Like just to give you an example, there is a book that I have from a student in Germany that for her thesis was researching the relationship between sharks and humans. And she decided to do the cover of the book with sandpaper. And sandpaper is the skin of the shark is known to be exactly as the feeling of sandpaper. So that alone was to me really, it's a very conceptual approach, but it's also trying to embody something about these other organism, and even taking the book as an embodiment of this other organism right away as you're holding it. So there are a lot of strategies like that can be applied to the book as an object, as an artifact, that can not necessarily even through words or images, but even from a tactile perspective or scent. I mean, there's a few books that I'm focusing on that incorporate some element of scent or synthesize smell to try to immerse yourself in a world where how fungi are going to smell from particular part of the world in a few years, affected by climate change. Things like that is really exciting for me to see, that the book basically adopting engaging other senses as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned sandpaper, because I think that was one of the things in the catalog about all the products from a pig, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. It just kind of makes me think about also the fact that like the body of animals and bodily products are used to actually physically make books.
The leather, leather binding, the bone glue for the text block is sometimes coming from part of the bone. It's we don't even think about it, but that's also a book is also can have components that come from animals.
Yeah, this kind of leads me into another like kind of larger topic that I was interested in, which is sort of the intersection of books and the body of the reader. I guess now we're kind of talking about books and body of animals, but from the perspective of this kind of experience that you have as a reader physically when you're interacting with a book. I guess I've been kind of encountering in a lot of places, for example, in the book Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet is one place where they do this a lot, but kind of the idea of the framework of haunting to describe a certain way of being, or like the idea of feeling physically immaterial forces in this kind of spectral way. And I guess I've been kind of stuck on this as I've been thinking about books and publishing, because I think it's sort of similar to the experience of reading and what drives my thinking about like the somatic elements of books. And yeah, this way that your body kind of becomes a conduit for a book, and the book kind of needs you in order to be brought into the world as the reader, and the physicality of that. Yeah, and the way that we kind of become made up of all these things that we read in an intangible way. And these are also like ideas that I've been working on with a lot of different people since the start of my fellowship. And yeah, I'm kind of curious about how these ideas of books and bodies are playing a role in your practices. And yeah, maybe from the perspective of the kind of spaces that you want to create that people need to enter in order to actually interact with books, or yeah, even how publications kind of move between bodies or move beyond bodies. Just all these kind of embodied aspects of book creating, I guess, is what I'm interested in. Would love to hear more of your perspective.
Yeah, I can actually quickly bring up a quote that I really love. So I don't know if many of you are familiar with the archivist Ulises Carrion. He was a Mexican archivist, conceptual artist who worked a lot in the 80s, 70s and 80s. He opened in 1975, a year before printed matter. Here in New York, he opened in Amsterdam what is considered the first artist book store in history. He was a gay Mexican curator and archivist, and I found in preparation for the show at Center for Book Arts, I wanted to open the catalog with a quote by him that I thought was really provocative. So I will read it to you. So the quote says, I firmly believe that every book that now exists will eventually disappear. And I see here no reason for lamentation. Like any other living organism, books will grow, multiply, change color, and eventually die. So to me, that was extremely, extremely exciting and subversive coming from an archivist, saying that he was already considering, the nightmare of an archivist is that the books disappear, and he's already preparing everyone to accept that books are here. They have a shelf life in a way. They're kind of, we think of them as eternal, but they also have a shelf life, like us, like any organism. And I like that, and I think intuitively this is why humans like books, because they're sort of like us. They're physically manifested. They can deteriorate and wear, and if you don't take care of them, they can just be gone, disappear, merge with the soil. This is to me really refreshing, and I always keep it in mind. And yes, that's something I wanted to share.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I've been thinking about that sort of too, because I've been talking with artists recently who work with like performance and music, and maybe like forms that we would kind of think are inherently more ephemeral, and then their experience translating that to working with books and feeling like, in a way, quite intimidated by the way a book might present as being this literally kind of bounded permanent object. But at the same time, speaking with other people who are really highlighting the ways that books are also very slippery, and even like before they've disintegrated, like their circulation, they kind of take this momentum within themselves. And yeah, there's sort of this tension between being this very stable thing with a beginning and an end, and being this kind of endless thing at the same time. And I've been kind of noticing a lot of people grappling with that. I think it kind of relates to what you're saying a little bit. Aiden, did you have anything you wanted to jump in with?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I was just kind of thinking about how books exist with us and in different spaces. And my partner was recently telling someone the story of how we met, which was actually at one of my events that I was hosting in LA. And I brought my the library, the books I'd collected so far, and I brought a rug, and I just put it on the floor of the gallery and put all the books on it. And he was just talking about how like intrigued he was by that. And the rug was kind of dirty. I like just brought it straight from home. But it's one that has all these like animals on it. And yeah, just thinking of like that as that presentation was something that he was like, oh, I have to like get on the ground and like look through this pile. And kind of the strangeness of that, but also like, I don't think that was like fully the concept of like making people kind of like get into this different perspectival position. But yeah, there's something about them of like, but to get into the little secrets that all these things have, you sometimes have to go through great lengths. Yeah, and even like I always take books, multiple books traveling, and like whenever I'm finishing one or reading it, it's like it is like part of my memory with the landscape. I find that like that physical action is like embedded within what's happening, the framework of my situation. And it's such an interesting thing. I mean, even sometimes like the little things that end up like a squished bug in it or something, or like some sand, whatever, like the things that then become part of the bodies of these objects. They're like companions in their own way. And yeah, I think that to me feels important, especially, I mean, I like, when you're talking about Oscar, the quote with like the kind of decay that also exists with them. It's like, I love like a little paperback book the most because they get beat up and they get lost and they get dropped in puddles, and they're like, they are ephemeral. But they also like through that have so much character, and like, I think we can grow so easily attached to them, just in their physicality and the way that we bring them around with us. So yeah, there is something that's very like visceral and just kind of like, I don't know, integral about the physical relationship to books.
Yeah, I also like, Oscar, that you brought up this idea before about maybe publishing is like people drawing patterns on caves as well. Because I've been kind of researching into the history of risograph printing as a method, and that risograph works through like stencil duplication. So also kind of taking it further into just thinking about stencils as a concept and as a method a bit more abstractly, and realizing that like the first stencils that were in use were actually like someone's body. Like they would just put their hand on the wall and then kind of like smear pigment around. And the physicality of the printing method has always kind of been from the start. And it's kind of nice to think of that as like the birth of publishing in a way.
And even that's interesting because even Riso sort of deteriorates over time, totally. With the friction of your hand.
Riso never dries because the ink is water soluble, and every time someone touches the publication, their fingerprint and the actual lines from their finger are probably going to get on it if they touch the text in any places. That was kind of a funny learning curve to go over, I guess, when I first started working with Riso, of like trying not to be precious about that, or actually like embracing the fact that every time someone touches the book, it leaves like an actual trace. Yeah, I think, so I guess since we've been sort of focusing a bit on form or medium, but I also want to talk a little about content. And I think recently I read the phrase scientific imagination and artistic research. And I realized that I think the term artistic research is coming up all the time. And I think people are considering artistic epistemologies as very capable of producing knowledge. But I realized that I hadn't really heard the term scientific imagination, maybe more just science fiction, but I kind of feel like there's a distinction between these two. So I was kind of curious to ask, like, using the book as this form with traditionally a lot of power and authority, when it comes to publishing ecological thought or about interspecies relationships, how do you find yourself working with this kind of established power in a subversive way? And maybe drawing on this idea of scientific imagination, and kind of how you dance around this boundary between fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah, this is a really interesting, tension between the two. I mean, to give you an example, for the show in 2021, I invited Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg, who's she's a bio designer, speculative designer, researcher, and a few years before, in 2016, I believe, she was asked by a journal on fungal genetics, so it's a real scientific journal, to do an intervention on the cover of the journal, and she included this image of fictional organisms that could be um, inhabiting the forest and using pollution, or sort of like synthesizing pollution to clean the forests. So it was really, kind of a radical moment when a real scientific journal opens their cover to a speculative artist. I think that's things like this. I'm not very familiar with the scientific community in a way that I'm not sure how open they are to more speculative imagination, but to me it seems like they are, but there's some tension there because it's not peer reviewed, or it's kind of like hypotheticals. Whereas the artists are a little bit more free in that sense. There is more less fears in a way to just really go out there and explore, imagine worlds, imagine situations. One of the earlier books I showed in my brief presentation was also by Dougal Dixon, who is a scientist, paleontologist, who imagined this, world where humans are no longer there. That is an interesting example too, because it was a reaction from him as a scientist, in the sense that he grew up, or even when he was in school, there was a lot of campaigns saying "save the whales." It was in like the earlier green movement, and he was very curious. Why save the whales? What about when the whales are gone and even we are gone? What is after that? So this kind of thinking allowed him to think beyond the human, and how life will emerge in different ways and innovative ways beyond our presence. So it's a completely non-human centric imagination. But yeah, this is an area I'm really interested in. I'm constantly fascinated by the sort of tension that exists between the two worlds, and in my experience, when they kind of like collide, it's really exciting, and it opens up a lot of new questions.
I also feel maybe to even just like the concept of truth, because I think I found myself using like techniques in fiction, in terms of narrative techniques or like speculative fiction, to kind of convey something that I experienced, but in a way that if I had just written it out exactly the way it happened, it wouldn't actually convey my feeling of the truth of what happened, if that makes sense. And kind of using like tools of speculation to convey something that was perhaps even more true. And I've noticed a lot of documentaries doing this as well, like using kind of fantasy or fantastical elements to paint a picture of someone in a way that seems more true than if they had just kind of taken a lens to what was actually there.
Yeah, I think like my relationship with biology and a lot of the sciences, and working sometimes with ecologists, is like, a lot of their work is speculative. Like, so much is like building hypotheses and building ways to research those, and kind of like be curious about conclusions. And I think understanding that everything changes. Like, I think I don't know, I find that sometimes there's an interesting dynamic between what kind of the public perceives as set reality, which is science often, or like in Western cultures, but within the sciences, there's like an understanding that what we know or believe is changing constantly based on research, and that's of course also culturally informed. Yeah, and I think that like one of the things that I have definitely tried is to reach out and work with people from like working biologists. And some of that is from like an early experience I had in 2014 where a good friend of mine, Lisa Schoenberg, who's an entomologist, but also a musician, percussive performer. And yeah, and she invited me on a research trip with her to Hawaii to study the Hylaeus bee, which is like the only native bee to Hawaii. And yeah, kind of was someone who was like already had these things kind of very integrated in her life, which was being both a scientist, a working entomologist, and being an artist and musician. And yeah, working with her is like, oh, these things are like, these go together great. Like, wow, this is like so fun and interesting. And, you know, maybe having that early experience with someone who could speak both languages in some ways, like really helped me feel like there was so much space there to explore, and that it felt really welcoming. Because yeah, like her is kind of like the liaison to these conversations. And in that trip, yeah, we met with a lot of different types of kind of researchers, and yeah, the conversation that came out of that, like I was so engaged by and interested in. And you know, the final product was a book, which also is like really cool to be like, oh, how do you bring these different disciplines together? And she also composed a bunch of scores that were performed based on field recordings from that trip too. But like the piece that people largely came in contact with was this book that documented that trip. And so I think from that experience, like, yeah, I've been always really excited to talk to people who are doing field research, and they're generally really open and curious too. And you know, I'm sure there's like at times kind of a skepticism of like, well, does that accurately depict this situation? Or, you know, that arts can get a little frivolous perhaps. But also that there's like an openness to play within that kind of like boundary land. So I find it really exciting and fun to engage with. I think the hardest part is just that it's from each side, it's very hard to access the other. Which is kind of the nature of our institutions, which is like there's not a lot of space in which these things are integrated. You really have to be like proactively searching for the other than like the kind of people that do exist, like Lisa or other. I've found some other folks who do have like a history in art, but they work in sciences, or they like, yeah, have kind of gone from one to the other. And yeah, they've been really important people in my life of like bringing together these things as someone who I'd say is like predominantly from arts and arts communities. So yeah, I think it's like, it's unfortunate that we all have to kind of like work harder to connect those things, but I think there really is like an openness in doing that. And like, it's so rewarding to just like try and to reach out.
Totally. Mila in the chat says we need a plural strategy, and that's why I celebrate your projects. Yeah, I think I've been really interested for a while because I have like an academic background in environmental studies and gender studies, and then kind of was getting into practicing studio art and like seeing the different ways that was or wasn't difficult to do within like the structures that are already like surrounding academia and just education in general. But I really love like Jack Halberstam's concept of the anti-disciplinary. So it's not even like looking between disciplinaries, it's like completely dissolving the border between them and the idea of a discipline in general. And I feel like that's sort of what you were getting towards at the end there. I want to open it up for the audience to ask questions really soon, but I just wanted to ask one more thing that I was really curious about. Oscar, I saw on the Center for Book Arts site that talking about your project, the Anti-Library, there was a statement or like a sentiment that said the book remains the most advanced information technology ever devised by humans. And I was sort of wondering two things related to this idea. I think one, like what is kind of at stake when it comes to using the book as a way to think through interspecies relationships if the book has this kind of status, but also like if we think of a book as this distinctly human information technology, I wonder what it looks like to circulate information at a different scale, like scale or register of kind of the non-human. Yeah, and maybe you guys have come across some examples of that in your various research or practices, or maybe not, but
Yeah, I mean, I still think so. I still think that the book is a really, I think it's like it's a very sophisticated tool that we have developed to share information, to share stories, ideas, proposals, that it's kind of an intuitive tool across cultures. And I think there's something that really kind of moved me and motivated me is the fact that a lot of younger artists or independent researchers, they arrive at the book as their method of spreading their work. And I think that's really something that I respect, because it's not so much about how many you produce. You know, maybe your budget doesn't allow you to produce more than a few dozen copies. It's the fact that artists use it as a way, and I remember hearing this phrase somewhere: to print is to resist. Just this idea of manifesting something that then can touch other people's lives, even if it's a handful of people. You know, it's really important. So yeah, I mean, my motivation with this project and researching the book as an information tool is in highlighting that aspect of the book. You know, that it is a very democratic medium. You know, because anyone can print and make a book technically with very cheap, with really little means available. In other sense, it's actually weirdly is becoming more sophisticated than digital technology, because anything that's digital is kind of ends up in a server, right? It escapes your control in some way, or it escapes this kind of more organic growth. In books, it's so weird, but when you enter a second-hand bookstore, all of those books are not perhaps they're not in any catalog. They're just adopting a life of their own. And I really enjoy that about books, the fact that they're untrackable, physically untrackable. They escape the algorithm. It's just you and this artifact having a communication, having some sort of transfer of knowledge or ideas. In terms of the book extending into the non-human, like the beyond the human sort of realm, I mean, I'm noticing more and more books in the last couple of years where artists are attempting to utilize the book as a way to express non-human languages or non-human communication. So the means are no longer a script that is readable to us, but perhaps that means something to other species, and they end up being these cryptic documents, right? These documents that are attempting to translate signals or signs left by beetles on a piece of bark, or fly larvae on plants, as they're feeding on the plants, they leave these kind of signs or symbols. So yeah, I mean, even artists now, they're like sort of arguing, is the book enough to express ideas that are beyond the human, or messages that are beyond humans communicating to other humans. That is an area that is kind of developing, that I'm noticing, and that I'm paying attention to. And I don't know how that's going to evolve, but this is up to imagination.